So welcome to the continuation of the swing library. So well actually let's run it before we start talking too much. And as always, if you want me to give you a break, just let me know. I sometimes lose myself. Yeah. So now that we centered everything, in this case, now we centered everything. We want to do a bit more than just an empty window. This is a bit useless, right? Let me just make sure it's recording. Good. So what we want to do is to add, so here we have this. So inside swing, we want to add something that we call components. Right? So components would be anything that is like on that, such as buttons, labels, etc. Okay, so components would be buttons, labels, text box, blah blah blah. And then we'll talk about the rest part after. So what we want to do, so what we want to do is we want to add a, let me run it one more. Actually, how do I get that thing going? There we go. So we want to add something there to give us more meaning, like something to click on, something to read from, etc. So what we're going to do, first we could always do this from main, as always. We could create this inside here, but the fact is, again, we want to have clean code, so we want to keep our main as empty as possible and only having the algorithm for our application, right? Everything else should go in the specific, let's say, class and whatnot. So inside our GUI, we know in this GUI is always going to have the same thing. So maybe, you know what, inside the initialization, we want to also initialize buttons and so forth. So actually, we'll do it here first, and then we'll do it over there. So if we wanted to, again, this is because this is also a JFrame. It's the same as this, right? GUI is a JFrame. So if we wanted to, we could just say, yeah, let's do it right here. We could say, let's create a label. So always starts with J. And I'm going to call it label, let's say, for the name. So a couple of things here. We'll talk about it in a second. And we're going to say new J label and do Control P to see if there's anything to say there. So you'll notice already there is 5 constructors there, and one of those constructors is string text. Another constructor is an image. That's an interesting thing. So you could put an image inside of a label, right? There's one constructor where you could take a string, a text, an icon, and if it's aligned or whatnot. Look at the name, tells me everything without reading any description, without reading anything. So using the IDE is really meaningful, right? So in this case, if I wanted to, I could set the text here. Blah, blah, I don't know. And last thing I need to do, because if I run it right now, you notice it doesn't appear anywhere. We have to say who is the container that contains this text. So in this case, I want that window I created to add this component to it. So add LBL name. And if you notice now, there is a little text here saying blah blah. Cool? Easy stuff. So again, the objects and everything, the guy who wrote the swing library does this for us. And this is the cool part. Otherwise, this would have been another 1,000 lines, 2,000. Any questions? So everything is a component inside the swing library. So if I go ahead and I control-clicked on my JLabel here, you'll notice a JLabel extends a J component, right? And that's useful because when you're trying to add something here, you'll need to give it a component. So components are labels, images, buttons, whatever. Cool? Any questions? Again, anything I say also goes into the quizzes, so you gotta You gotta make sure you understand. And if you have a question, stop me. Now, this constructor is there to help us out, but we could have also used any of the functionalities it gives us, such as LBL name dot set text, the first one that pops up. Something else. And now if we run it, our blah 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 is kind of gone. Right? So even though I initialized it with this, set text modifies it and makes it something else. If I wanted to keep the blah 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 and add something to it, well, here we could have said LBL name dot get the text and concatenate it with something else. So now you should see blah 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 something else. Right? Normal concatenation, get the value, concatenate with something else. That's the new set value. Cool? Any questions? And as we learned about it, we could also set the bounds of this LBL name inside there. So we could just say set bounds again. So we could say where the location is, X and Y. So let's say 200, 200, and what the width and height would be. Let's say 130, as an example. So let's see what happens inside that. In this case, nothing happened. Cool? We could set those, but this requires it. We require to do something before we could use it as a location. And that's, I'm going to get there in a second, okay? But just keep in touch with the set bounds. Okay? We're going to talk about the layout managers in a second. So we'll come back to this set bound. So right now it doesn't do anything. And the thing is, even though we created this outside, again, you see it's a lot of meaningless jibber jabber to initialize our label and to add it to this window. So we could have grabbed this, go inside my window, my GUI class, and inside the initialize, we could have also add that here. And rather window.add, it would just be add. Right? I kept this and the super just to say that it's all the same thing in this scenario. Right? The difference would be this super is using the parents class set size, but at the same time it inherited all the functionalities. And not saying that this doesn't hurt you anything because it's using context. So now if we run it again, without it being here, right, it would still show us blah, blah, blah something. So let's go do it a bit further. So right now we have the blah, blah, blah something. Let's go add some other stuff. We could also add, let's say, labels are just to display, right? So labels, let's actually add that somewhere. Say here. Actually, I'll do it in main. I can't make up my mind. So labels, it's to display something. Text box, on the other hand, again, this should be called JLabel, J components. These are components, but again, inside Swing, they all start with the letter J. And this one is actually, I think, Textfield. So this time, the label allowed us to display something. In the case of a text field, it allows us to display plus get user input in there. Right, so if we go back to here, let's go ahead and create that in there as well, J. And if you type in J, you'll get all the Swing stuff. So this is kind of useful. We could see all the variations, all the components that we could have. Cool? So look into that. On your Moodle, I give you a bit of a couple pages, a couple links to places where you could see these different things that are out there. So anyway, we're going to create a Jtextfield. And I kind of like to do these things where I understand if this variable is a label or not. And this is something I got as a habit. You don't need to do this. But I usually start the name of the variable with what it is, such as this is a label name. So it always kind of reminds me that I can't really change a label. Okay, and this is something I got as a habit. Depending on the company you go, they'll have different standards. You do as you want. And Textfield, you could do the same thing. I usually take some words in there and make it into something, or it's a standard. So in this case, I like it because it's an input, so I'll put the word input there. And let's say, again, an input name, I don't know, really, Jtextfield. And again, I could do Control P to see what kind of overload does this constructor have. So one without parameters, one that takes a string text, one that says columns, one that takes both, etc., etc. So if I wanted default values, I could do it with the string text, some placeholder text. Sorry guys, 1 second, my cat is demanding some petting. Come over here, you. Alright, so while my cat makes me bleed with her claws, let's continue this. So again, we could set the bounds, but it's not going to do much for now. Set bounds. Sorry, my hands are tight. Okay, so set bounds, and again, we're going to give it some values. Let's say the same value and see what happens. 200, 200, 100, and 30. And again, for now, it most likely will do nothing. And we're going to have to add this component to our JFrame, which is our GUI. So we're going to do add, and we're going to add, what was it called? Input. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to deal with the cat at the same time as you guys. So I'm going to run this. And notice that my input field is not available. It's not being shown. Okay? The problem that's going on here is right now I have no layout manager, the one that decides the location of things, the one that says where everything should be. There is no such person at this moment. Okay? So none of the locations are being respected. Okay, 1 second, I'm just gonna throw my cat away. All right, time for you to leave. Okay, so none of my stuff is being respected, and at this moment, because I'm setting locations, I want to use something called absolute coordinates. Absolute coordinates meaning I'm gonna specify exactly, like I've been doing here, where my components are gonna go. And to be able to do this, we need to make sure that we set the layout manager to null. So we don't want anyone to take care of this. By default, there is a manager that does it. Let's see if it tells us, system blah blah blah, blah blah. Root pane container, I don't know what's the default, we could look into it, but for now I want to set it to null. So no one to take care of managing my components. Okay, so null is what it's doing. So because of null, now my absolute coordinates are going to come into play. And you're going to see as I run my application, oops, wrong one here. If I go back to my main and I run my application, let's run it one more time because it's behind my window as I was playing with it. You'll notice that my locations are being set, and you'll notice there's two things overlapping each other, right? This is because they're both at the same coordinates. So let's go ahead and change that. So let's say this one, we're gonna make it 50, make this one 100, and this one, we want it to be right after or right beside something else, right? Right beside the label. So I could either put it at the end of the X, and that would be X plus the width, then that would be the starting location, right? Because the label is going to start at this position. Actually, let's run it. The label is going to be at position 50, right? If we look here, the label is at position 50, and it's going to take 100 space. So 100 space. So then we could start our text box directly there. So 50 plus 100, 150. Let's give it 160, just a little bit of distance space. And the Y, we could leave it on the same number. So now, wherever it went. So now if we rerun our application, you'll notice they're going to be side by side. Actually, right now we have a error. We'll fix that in a second. But look at here, side by side. Cool? Any questions? So now if I wanted to place this text field right under it, what do you think I would need to do with the X, Y's? Well then, again, we want to start at X50. Well, sorry, this time we're talking about the Y. So the X we could ignore. We want it to be the same, right? The same horizontal location, so going left to right. So we want both of them to start at 50. We want the Y to be right under blah 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 something. So the Y of the blah 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 starts at 100, and it has a height of 30. So this little thing from the top of the B to the bottom of the B, so the top of the B over here to the bottom of the B, it's, well, hopefully taking only 30 space. So what we want to do is from that Y location 100, we want to go down by 30. So over here should be 130. Right? We want to give it an extra bit for it to have some space, but let's try it without giving it an extra bit. See how it goes. And again, I have some refresh problem. I'll fix that later. So here it's given 30. That includes probably it's bigger than what it needs for the text. And you'll notice some placeholder is right under it. Cool? You also notice that some placeholder is actually a field where I could put text. So maybe you don't want to have text in here. That's your choice. Again, I'm having some refresh issue. We'll fix that in a second. Oops. There we go. Any questions? Now, we have this refresh issue because it's not refreshing the window as you're adding new things. So something that is set to fix this, you could either forcefully refresh. Sorry, I'm getting cat hair in my mouth now. So something we could do is forcefully refresh our window, or a technique everyone wants to use is that set visible. That's the last thing you want to do when you're initializing your window. So as you put stuff in there, the last thing you want to do is set visible, which automatically will refresh the window. So now, if we run it, we shouldn't see that problem where something is not appearing correctly. It will always appear correctly. Remember that because you're going to get that issue. Cool? Sorry, I'm still trying to take out the cat hair from my mouth. Let's just shrink it down. All right. So cool, we got two things going on using the absolute coordinates. Any questions about our current code before I move on? I kind of like to also put the set layouts down there. Actually, I like to do all of this down there. There we go. So the stuff that's related to the windows together, those will keep it up there, it's fine. If you have any questions, this is the moment before I move on to the next button. Let's add one last thing. And again, there's a lot of different components, but let's add a J button. btn, let's say accept. And maybe we want to modify this in a second. And btn stands for button. And again, I'll do Control P, and you'll notice there's a lot of overloads for this function, for this constructor as well. I could set the button to have an icon. I could have it as a string, an action, whatever that is, a string text with an icon, etc., etc. In this case, we'll just write accept, and we're gonna set the bounds. btn accept set bounds, and we're gonna set it. Let's set it 50, 130, 130. I don't really know exactly what I want, but this one I'm gonna set it. I'm gonna set this one 150 and this one the same. Right? So now the button is gonna be on the next line, but this is gonna be on the same line. And I'm not seeing my button. Did I not put it correctly? Ah, it's being overlapped. No, actually, just give me a second. So let's change this a bit. This text over here, we're gonna write, I don't know, please, and over here we're gonna say, enter your name. Over here is we're gonna grab his name, and over here we're gonna press the accept button. Let's rerun this. And you'll notice that my button is still not showing. And you'll notice also this text is, this width is not enough. So maybe we want to move this width to 150, and we want to start this one at 200. Now guys, knowing all the stuff you learned, the window size is probably not best. Maybe we want to make this width 150 as well, and make the window, we give it in the beginning. Let's make it a bit bigger, 500. Actually, we'll make the width 600 and the height 300. Sounds pretty fun. Okay, knowing everything you know, now that I get this, could I ignore this one? Knowing everything you know, why is my button not showing on the screen?
So visibility?
Visibility, what should I do?
Making the button visible.
So, okay, let's do that. btn accept dot visible.
But shouldn't we add it?
Yeah, we need to add it to our JFrame. If you don't add it, it doesn't know where it's going. It could have went to another frame. It could have went anywhere else. You need to always specify things. Again, the computer is stupid. It cannot predict or know that that's what you want to do. So in this case, we need to add this component, which is our btn accept. All right? Cool? Any questions? So, let's say we created all of this. 1 second. Just want to see what's the next thing I want to do. Okay. Let's say we created all of this. We want to do something when the button gets clicked. So when it gets clicked, I want to do something, right? So in this case, when the button gets clicked, btn accept, I want to add an action listener, and we're gonna do maybe today. Hopefully, we'll explain how this thing does it. It's something called, it's a design pattern called observer, or sometimes also referred to as the what was that other word that we use? Anyway, we'll come back to this observer pattern or listener. There we go. Okay, either word is the same thing. So there's a design pattern called observer or listener, and that's how they do it. We'll talk about this hopefully today or probably another day. Now, whenever the button gets clicked, we want to create an action, something that would happen. Okay, what do we want to do? So, in this case, we want to call someone that's an action listener. So in this case, if you look here, it requires an action listener. So someone that could manage this, someone that could do something about this, right? So a new action listener type of thing. You could do this right here like this. This is called anonymous class. Okay? It's called an anonymous class because you cannot ever refer to it again. It's not usable anywhere else. And this is nice because it hides the information about this button, this click. So no one can directly call this function action perform. Okay, and if we look inside an action listener, you'll notice it's actually a interface. So it's basically a rule, a set of rule. And the set of rule in this case is you need to implement the function action performed, right? And E being the event that's being processed. Is it a click? Is it a drag? Is it whatever? It doesn't matter, right? So whoever action listener is, you need to implement it, and you need to implement and define action performed. So in this case, we could create this thing we call a anonymous class. And this is good because no one could ever call this function action perform. I can't go ahead and say action perform. It doesn't exist. Okay? So this thing is called a anonymous class. But at our level, at this moment, we are not going to use this because it's a bit too hard to read. And we're aiming not for complexity, we're aiming for clean code at this moment. So this thing, I'm going to keep it there for you. I'm going to comment it out. And this thing is called a anonymous class. So anonymous class, useful to hide one-time, let's say as an example, one-time use functions. So we don't want anyone to be able to call this. We don't want other people inside our team to call this function and so on. But for now, we're kind of going to go away from anonymous class, and we're going to use the actual way, well, not the actual way, but we're going to go and give it an action listener. Okay, we're going to create an action listener, and whenever the button gets clicked, it will know who to call. And this is important. So again, when we give it an action listener, right, the class that does the events, the one that's looking at the button if it's pressed or not, when the button gets pressed, it knows that you'll have a function called action perform. Okay, and later today, hopefully, we'll talk about observer pattern, and I'll explain this a bit further. But right now, all you need to understand is, because of this interface, remember this is polymorphism, because of this interface, we know for a fact that there's going to be a function called action perform, and we're going to call that, and it's going to perform that action when that button gets clicked, this button exit. I hope it kind of makes sense. So what we need to do is to give it someone that has this function action perform. And again, we could have done it with the anonymous class, but in this case, what we want to do is we want to make our GUI deal with any button clicks, any type of action performed. So what we're going to do is this action listener, I need to make it our GUI as well. So GUI is a JFrame. GUI is also, or has, what did we say last time? Anyway, let's say is a, well, has a part basically, is also, or you remember the annoying part, this is what we're talking about, is also, what did we say? Action listener. In this case, it has the action listener functionalities. How would I do that? knowing that an action listener is an interface? Anyone? So, because it's an interface, we cannot say extends. And again, you got to remember that inheritance in Java, there's only one inheritance allowed. So you could only inherit from one thing, not more. But the thing is about action listener is we want to only implement action perform. It's not really GUI is a action listener. It's just GUI has the abilities of an action listener. That sounds better. Has the ability of an action listener. So in this case, we're going to say class GUI extends JFrame. GUI is a JFrame, which also implements action listener. Right? And that's this guy. Okay, which comes from the AWT thing. So now you'll notice we're getting an error. Hey, if you're implementing something, you better implement those methods given to us. So in this case, the method is action performed. Right? If you look over here, public void action performed, which gets an action event E. Public void action performed, which gets an action event E. And again, we're doing this because the guy, let's say the computer or whoever it is, that's checking for this button to be clicked, it doesn't know when it's going to get clicked, first of all. Secondly, it needs to know what function to call. If you would have created your own function and called this, well, it has no idea that you would have named it this. You could have said button clicked, and again, how does he know that you would have named it button clicked? It doesn't. So what it's doing is, so actually if we go inside, well, we're going to set it up and you're going to see how it's going to be doing it. So let's say here, we're going to just output it to the console for a second. Button got clicked. And we'll come back to this in a second. So now we need to make sure our button calls this function when it gets clicked on. To do that, we would do btn accept dot add action listener, and we're going to give it this object, which is the current object. And we could do that because it implements action listener. Right? We're becoming a bit more complex our stuff. That's why the core foundation of your OOP is really important, because it allows us to do much. It allows us to be more flexible, allows us to do more weirder things. A lot of abstraction. Okay, so we need to add this action listener so that when button gets clicked, it will call this object's action perform function. Right? So if we just run it just to make sure it works, and then we'll talk about it a bit more. So when I click on this, button got clicked. If I click it again, button got clicked. It doesn't know when I'm going to click it, but when I do, it will show and do whatever is inside action performed. Cool? Any questions? I could click it a lot of times. Okay, so let's come back to here for a second. Now, again, we're going to talk about observer class, the design pattern a bit later, hopefully today. Actually, I think I'm going to bring the quiz somewhere around 7:30, and we'll do a whole class until 6:30. We're already behind because of the 3-day review. So this action perform, if we look over here at action listener, if we go there, it requires an action listener because it has an array list. I'm not sure if it's an array list, but we could go look at it. It's an event listener list, okay? And inside that, let's say array list, inside that list, it keeps adding this action listener that's coming in, right? It adds every action listener that comes in. And this is important because when that button gets clicked, so let me see if I could find, where is the click button? J button. I want to just show you because it's implementing abstract button. It's probably done this. Okay, let's see here. Do click. When the click happens, it's gonna go through each person that it had. Where was the person? There's too much abstraction to find stuff easily. Actually, you know what? Let's do something else. Inside the J button, actually inside our GUI, let's go back to add action listener. Listener list over here. This is removing action listener, getting it action listeners, changing action listeners. Let's see what else functions it has. Don't want to read all this. 1 second. Button change listener. 1 second. Fire action perform. There we go. This is the one we want. So at the moment that something happens, either clicks, drags, or whatever, look what it's going to do. It's going to go through each one of those listeners. Right? For each one of those listeners, it's going to call a function. What function? It's going to call, let's go back to our GUI for 1 second. It's going to call action performed. Now look over here. Here is getting the action command. Let me show you. Action performed. There we go. At this line, it doesn't know who it is. You could have had any classes, as many buttons, as many different variations. But the action listeners, the ones that are action listeners, it's going to call the only function it knows it exists inside that action listener, which is action performed. Does this make sense? And this is the design pattern called observer or listener, and we're going to see that a lot. And it's something to note because you're going to be using it a lot. This is a design pattern that's non-stop you're going to see. Okay, and I hope it makes kind of sense. So the point of all of this, they're using polymorphism. They're basically saying, I don't know who's the person I'm clicking on, or sorry, I don't know who's the person I'm informing. I'm letting them know that the button got clicked. I don't know who it is. But I know for a fact that they have a function called action performed. Right? Whoever that guy is. So you see, here is typecasting it to action listener because they implement action listener, implements action listener. So we could kind of say GUI is an action listener as well. So GUI becomes action listener and he has a function action perform. And this is one of the major uses of having interfaces, is because we could not care about what class he has, but because he implements that function, we know for a fact it has that function. Right? Any questions? This is the part where usually people don't understand. But the problem is, when you don't ask any questions, I don't know what you're having trouble to grasp. And I know probably I'm not explaining this as well as it should. But you need to ask me questions to make this more clear. Okay. So no questions? Let's move on. I think someone unmuted for a second, but I didn't hear anything.
Sir,
Yes.
so action listener basically used for the clicking purpose. Means if we click upward arrow, then it will listen that action that you click that arrow.
Yes, well in this case, it's for the button. So when the button gets clicked, it will call this function for us. And then we put the logic inside this function, whatever that logic be. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
And if we look at our input name, you'll notice we could also add an action listener to it. And we could also put that inside here. Now, even though our button and our text field both have an action listener, it does not mean it is just a click. This action event is going to tell us what it is, right? If we look at the object given to us, this E object, sorry, I can't scroll down. Just want to make this in my middle. So this E object, this action event given to us, If we look at all the functionality it has, could let us know a bit more about the details of what's going on.
So, sir, basically we can compare with this on-click event function. Means we can check that the user clicked uh, which key.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, exactly. We actually, if it was the text field, we could figure out as he's typing what he's typing. We could deny him his typing. So if we wanted to make the text field only take in numbers, we could do that. We could figure out if it's the button that got clicked, or if it's the label that got clicked, or it's the other thing, right? We
can
could,
you more elaborate with the on-click event? Means if I press W, then it should say that you press W. Otherwise, it shows me that you press nothing.
one more time, I didn't understand that.
Um, I want to this clicking event to do something like if I press W, then it should say me that you press W.
Well, then you should do that inside the function here. When it gets pressed, whatever it is that you add the action listener, when it gets pressed, it's going to call this function and it's going to pass you this object action event, which gives you more details. So if you want to, let's say, click on W and showcase it on the console or something, or you press W, well, you need to do the logic in here, inside the body of action performed. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Any other questions? Okay, so let's do a bit more funky stuff. So I'm going to remove this text field action listener for now. So when I run the application at this moment, we currently have please enter your name. We could enter something, and when we press accept, it just says button got clicked. Let's do something else. Whenever he enters accept, so someone, before we go on, someone asked, Javid asked, is it possible to listen to gestures like click and drag? Yes, it is. You just need to go and look for that event and so on, okay? Swing and any other library, I am pretty positive that they added all these features because we are at the current time in the world, right? These gestures and clicks and whatnot are a standard, a normal thing that's going to happen at all times. So I'm pretty sure they already implemented it. You just need to do a little bit of research to see if you could drag, drop, and so on. Okay? And again, this is also why this is called add action listener and not add button click event listener, right? An action could be defined by almost anything. You'll just have to check for that. Cool? Maybe if we get some time, I'll do it. Maybe not. We'll see how far we go. Again, the GUI and the interface and using swing is not so important. The only thing that's important is these things that you're seeing here, it's going to be repeated. If you go into web, you're going to see the same thing. If you go inside Android, you're going to see the same thing. If you go in different libraries, it's the similar design. Why? Because that design is a good way of doing it. And hopefully we'll learn how to create our own stuff at some point. And that's the key that we're aiming for. So now, anyway, going back to here, if we run our application, when we enter something, let's say when we press accept, we want to do a bit more than just doing button got clicked on the console. We want to probably store that person's name, right? And to be able to store that person's name, that name that he entered, well, we need to go get the value from this text field, right? We need to go get that value from this input name text field. Now, when I get clicked, I want to check, actually let's say here, I want to put it to the console right now. So if we look at that variable over here, it's input name. If I go in here and I type in input name, you'll notice it cannot find that symbol. It cannot find that variable that you created. What's the problem here? Notice I created the variable right here. Why can I not see it here? This
because we are overriding method.
That's not the reason. overriding the method doesn't mean that you can't see other things inside your class. Notice that I created the variable here inside the function private void initialize. And I'm trying to access that variable inside action performed. Why is that? Why can I not see it inside a different function? Amita, you cut off too quick.
So it is a local variable which is accessible only inside that function.
Well done. So the problem is, when we created this variable input name inside the function initialize, the scope, the lifeline, the time this variable is going to exist, is only going to be within the body of that function. So the moment I reach the end of it at line 60, well, any variables you created here, you lose access to them. Doesn't mean they're going to get erased. It just means you don't have direct access to them. You don't have a variable that you could talk to it. So because I created the variable here inside the function initialize, I will not have access to it here inside of a different room, inside of a different function, right? So knowing that the scope of this is within this function, how can I fix it that inside action perform, I could also see that variable?
Object.
Sorry, go ahead, Abin.
I don't know, so by pointing to the object or something?
Okay, so let's say here you said pointing to the object. So this is the object, dot. I still cannot see input name, right? My IntelliSense says we're pointing to the object, but inside the object there is no input name. Cannot resolve symbol input name. Inside of an object, inside of a class, what do we have? The three major important things I told you guys. Inside of a class, inside of an object or a class is defined by a couple things. So again, let's put that here. So a class is a blueprint. A class is defined by three major things. The attributes that defines that object, that class. The actions, methods, right? So on. The attributes, fields, and variables. The action and methods. And lastly, the constructors, which is also methods, which help us set a rule. Rules of creation, let's say. So, we creating inside of a method limits the scope to initialize, limits the scope to the body of wherever we are, right? Which is this thing, 36 to line 68. If we wanted this to exist outside of this method, well then we want to make it exist within the class. And the class goes on to line 75. And notice action perform is within that scope. So what we want to do is to make that into a field, into an attribute of our GUI. So we could put, where was it? Input name, this thing, we copy it, we put it here. You'll notice now it's part of our GUI. Our GUI is defined by this text field called input name. And inside the initialize, rather than creating a new input name, we'll just go ahead and set the field, the attribute, to equaling that text field. Right? Notice the color change. So now the scope of this object that I created is not within this function, right? It's not within that function because it's not created here. It's actually created here. So the scope of it is within the class. So now you'll notice input name is accessible from anywhere within the class. Right? Let's not forget to put this as private. And we could do the same thing for private J label, LBL name, I believe I called it. Right? So as always, put the accessor, put a great name that explains what it is, and always initialize it. Even if you have to write no, it's fine, just write it until we get used to it and we move on from there. So now, this label here over as well, we could erase the type, because whenever we have a type, it means create a new variable called LBL name. We don't want to create a new one. We want to use the one we already created. And we're just creating the object. And the object's going to give us an address, and we have the address. The button, we could do the same thing, but in this case, the button is only useful here. We don't really care more than that. We're never going to access it to change the value of the text or something. If we do, well then we bring it up here, make it into a attribute. Cool? So let's go back here. So now, input name, again, this is an object, it's not the text. If I want to get the text, I have to do dot get. I could get the exposition, the alignment, etc. Get me the text maybe. Get the text. And as always, if I do Control Q, I could see what it returns. Public string get text. So I'm getting a string back, and now I could print out the name of the user. So if we run this, and I write in Reza, you'll notice it's going to print to my console Reza. If I say, I don't know, banana, banada, whatever, it will display that value. Is that clear? And obviously I could go ahead and change the value of something else, such as doing, let's say the LBL name dot set text, and we say the input name dot get text. So now if I change the name here to Reza, notice that the LBL object is this one, right? The LBL name. So as soon as I press accept, it changes that to Reza. If I change this to Pokemon, and I press accept, it changes it to Pokemon. Cool? Any questions? Okay. So there's a list of dialog boxes too. We could have done that too. So one of them is the J option pane. And we don't need to create this object. It will do it for us. We're going to say show a, there's a lot of these that you could try it out. Some of them, they give you an input, which returns back a string. Notice this is the return type, right? And others does other stuff. You need to go and look at all the variations. There's no point of me just saying it, okay? So we're going to do a show message dialog. We need to give it a couple things. The first thing is we need to give it the component that this belongs to, the parent component. And we're going to say this frame, right? This J frame, this GUI. And then we need to say the message. Let's say input name dot get text plus, actually let's put that before this. Hello. Concatenate the strings together. Now we could also give it a title, and we could give it a magic instance and all that shenanigans that's there. In this case, I don't really care for all of that, so we could just ignore it. Icons, title, etc. So now if I run it, stop and rerun. We say Reza, right? Look at these three things. So it's going to set the text of the LBL name to Reza. It's going to print it on my console. That's line 77. And on line 78, it's going to show me a message dialog, a dialog box. And that's a dialog box. I give you a link to all the variations of Dialog Box. You could check that out on your Moodle, or just do a quick Google search for this. Any questions? Now,
Hello.
yes, hi.
So can we show like the contents of this window into the other window?
Yes, until you have a reference to the other window. So that's a good question. So let's say, let's go back to our main. So far, my two windows, let's erase some space. So we have the window, that's the one that we're modifying, the GUI, etc. And we have this JFrame over here. Something I could do, let's go ahead and bring that JFrame on top here. Something I could do is get a reference of this window 1 into my window. Okay? So let's do a couple things. First of all, that window 1, this created a JLabel, right? So we could show some values. JLabel, LBL, text for window 1 equals new JLabel, and the text inside we could ignore. We're going to set that later. Okay, so then we're going to do window 1, add. What's the component we want to add? We want to add that label we just created. Right? If we put some values here and we run it, just to show you that it works, we do one step at a time, run it, make sure it works. We see ASDAS. So far, so good. Now we could do two things. We could either pass this label to our GUI, or we could pass this window to our GUI, but then we need to have access to that label again. It doesn't really matter. But the major thing is we need access to this label. So what we could do, well, what do you want to do? Do you want me to pass the window, or do you want me to pass the label? But in both
Label.
Okay. So if we want to pass the window, we could either pass it through the constructor, or we could create, let's say, we could create a new function where we could connect this label to it, right? So how about public void connect label, and we pass it a JLabel, the label, okay? I'm just creating this as I go. And inside here, what we want to do is pass in this label, LBL text form, to this window, to this object. So it gets a reference. So window dot, what do we call it? Connect labels, okay. Connect the labels, and we want to pass in LBL text for window 1, right? We're passing the address of where that object is. Now that I passed the object, right, connect label, you see it's not gray anymore. We want to create something so I could, we want to create a field so I could come back to this value and change it. So at the top, we could add private JLabel other window label equals null. Cool? So inside here, we could say this dot other whatever equals the label, right? Oops, sorry, I don't need to do that. Let's go back to the button. And again, we don't need the this because they don't overlap the names, right? So far, so good. And let's say when the button gets clicked, well, go show me all of these things, and as well go ahead and do other window label dot set text to input name dot get text. And we could add an extra thing here, other window, like this. Right. This is the cool part about references. So now, the moment I change the value here to Reza, and I press accept, notice that it changes it here too. It does all of these action performs. And at the connect label, the only thing we're doing is we're creating a reference to that label that got created. And that's the important thing. We need a reference to that object. Cool?
Yes, sir.
That's a great question, by the way. Anyone else has questions, doubts, ideas? Okay, no one else. So now what if we had more than one button? We have an accept and we also have a refuse. How do we know which one gets pressed or which one gets done or whatever? So let's go ahead and create a new button here right after, well, right after each other. You know what? I'll just put it. So be careful when you copy paste, okay? So this is a problem I keep saying. You copy paste and you forget to change one of these variable names. So in this case, I want to say btn refuse. And I put that all of the parts where it was. So be careful with copy pasting. I really strongly would say do not do that as a beginners, because you won't notice where your mistake is because of the copy paste. The copy paste won't give you a mistake. It's going to give you a logic error and you'll waste hours trying to figure out what's going on. So for button refuse, I'm going to have the text refuse. The bounds, the width and the height, I'm going to keep the same, but the bounds, I want it to be right after my button accept, right on the right. So in this case, the X, I want to move it towards the right. So the X plus the width of my accept would be 150. That's where I want my refuse. And as always, we'll test it out one thing at a time. So you see my refuse is there. And if I want to, I could space it out a bit more. Right now, we're just using absolute coordinates. Later on, we'll use a layout manager so we don't make it so ugly. Let the layout manager take care of it. So let's come back here. So now I have two buttons, refuse and accept. How do I know which one is running? So now if I click on refuse, it's showing the same thing as it would do for accept. And this is not a good thing. This is where action command comes into play. So here, I'm going to add, actually I'm going to do it second thing after creating that button, is I'm going to say button refuse set action command. And this is kind of giving me a label to our buttons so we could refer to it to figure out which one got clicked. Okay? So you'll notice it takes a string action command, and that action command could be whatever you want. Now, if I add it in here, this is bad practice. Usually you don't want to have a lot of these strings that's written out like this. Why? Because it becomes a pain in the butt to look for it, and if it changes, you have to go change it everywhere. Usually you want all of these to be variables or values that you retrieve from somewhere. So what we want to do for this action command is to go on top here. Actually, I'm going to put it before these attributes because it's finalized. I'm going to create private final string, and we're going to call it, so this is action command. So there's accept, action command. And I'm going to say in there, accept. So it doesn't care if I come here and I change it because I made it into a variable. Everywhere I use that variable will be the same thing, right? Because I set the values only one place, even though I use it multiple locations. Now I want to do another one for refuse. Cool? And they're finalized so they cannot be changed during runtime. You could do it before compile time, and that's perfectly fine. Cool? So now let's go back down here where I set action command. Rather than saying the text here, I would say this one is the refuse. And if ever I change the variable name, it's perfectly fine. And I could do the same thing for here. And I could set it to where is it? There we go. Cool. Any questions so far? So making this into a variable, well, actually I'll show you, I'll explain a bit further down. So having this action command allows us to figure out which button gets clicked. Is it refuse or is it accept during my action performed? Right? So here, now I could say, let's say, I could say if e dot get action command equals, let's say accept command. What do you want to do? Where if it did get clicked, I want to show all of that. Else, if let's say e dot get action command gets refused, and I'm saying the else if because we could have more buttons eventually, right, or more commands. This could have been easily an else statement. Okay, and you'll notice ID is going to give me a warning to not use double equal because that's not the correct way to compare strings. So usually you would use equals like this, okay? And we could talk about that another day. This is not so important. Cool? So now if the button that got initiated, the action that got clicked on is the accept, or if it's the refuse, do something. So let's take out two of these. Well, actually, let's take out these two lines, and we're going to put that inside the refuse. So depending on which one gets clicked, we're going to do different actions. Okay? So let's run that again. So now, if I put in Reza and I press accept, it should do this one. Notice that LBL name set text. Wait, what? It is working. Okay, sorry. Let's do it one more time. Let's say Pokemon. So if I press accept, wait, accept is not working. Why is that? Accept says LBL name set text to input name get text. LBL name is this. Did I forget to do accept? This is good. Look here. This is what happens when you copy paste. I forgot to change the variable name btn refuse. So now btn refuse has actually both action commands, and this is bad. Okay? So here it should have been btn refuse. It should have been btn accept. Copy pasting could cause issues. A lot of issues. And that stopped me and moved me away from my train of thought. So this is a bad thing to happen for us. So this is why we kind of want to avoid copy pasting at the early stages. If you don't want to listen to me, it's your choice. So now if I press accept, the LBL here, it should change, and it should give me a dialog saying, hello, Reza. Hello, Reza, and you'll notice the label is also changed. However, let's say Pokemon here now. If I press the refuse button, it should print it to my console, and the next window over here should change to other window input get text. It did the window and it did the console. Cool? Any questions? So the action command is to help us figure out which buttons got clicked. Right? And we're using a variable. Notice that we're using a variable. For the fact is, I could have misspelled this value multiple times. But if I use a variable, the IDE, the compiler, is going to let me know if I ever misspell something. It's going to say, hey, that variable doesn't exist. What are you doing? But if I start putting strings all over my code, eventually I'm going to come down to somewhere, I'm going to make a mistake, and I forgot a C somewhere, and it's going to mess up my code. Or I made a capital when it was a lowercase, and it's going to mess up my code. But because we're using a variable, the moment I change it here, it changes for all of them. So I could have changed this to this, and my code would still function correctly because it's not dependent on the value, it's dependent on the variable. So again, if I say whatever, accept, it still works out completely well. This is a good practice. Cool? Any questions? Now, we could clean up this part a bit more, such as we seeing action performed and we know there's two actions and it could have been more and so forth, so on. Rather than using if statements, which kind of looks a bit ugly, we could have converted this into a switch. Why a switch? Because both cases we're comparing this one value, right? If it was multiple things we're comparing in here, then it wouldn't be a good idea. But because it's just one thing, we could go ahead and say if this action command, in the case that is accept action command, do something, and in the case, well, let's do a break here, and in the case that it's a, oops, in the case that it's a refuse action command, do something else, and in the case that it's any but of the above, well, now we have a problem, so you should probably throw an exception, right? So now we could go ahead and copy these two lines. I'm going to keep both of them so you can see the difference. And we could copy these two lines. Let's make this a bit bigger. So notice that this, oops, this is in default. This shouldn't be here. Cool. Oops, let's not run it. So now if you notice, this, in my opinion, depends on you, this looks much cleaner than this. This is hard to read. And again, we're aiming for cleaner code. So a switch, depending on the action command, I'm going to do different things. Did it accept? Did it refuse? Any questions? So if you don't have a question, it's 5 o'clock. We could still do a bit more. We're just going to do one last bit for swing GUIs. And then, to be honest, afterwards, I'm never going to talk about this again. We're going to talk about design patterns, and we're going to move on from there in a bit. Okay, but the last thing I want to talk about, unless you have a question, you stop me right now. I'm actually going to comment this out. Okay, so ugly code. Same code as here in the switch, but this part is a bit uglier, right? If statements, there's not always. And again, if statements and switch, there's no such thing as one or the other. They're all the same. They're all if statements. This is done just to make it easier for us, for our eyes. Okay? So, the last thing we're going to do for swing that I'm going to talk about, and the rest is up to you. Actually, I'm going to ask you again, if you didn't understand something, you come back to me. I'm telling you, a lot of people, this is what I get every semester, is they go online and they listen to this guy talk about something and they make things they don't understand. And at some point I see a student having something here which says, I don't know, J-frame, and I ask them what the hell does this mean, and they don't know anything, and they just leave the code like that. And this might not cause an issue, but I'm going to take off points for you not understanding what you're doing. Okay? So, and I'm going to give you all these videos, so there's no reason you would go anywhere else. And the real reason for I hate you going somewhere else is because you're going to get some bad information, some bad ideas. And I welcome, if you ever want to challenge anything I say, saying this is not the correct way of doing it, explain to me why, and we'll go from there. Okay? I'm not a bad guy that would say, hey, my way is the only way. But I hate it when you learn incorrectly and it will affect you in your life. And I hope that makes sense. Okay, last thing we want to do is, so far we've been always setting bounds and whatnot. We're always been setting our layouts. Well, sorry, we've been setting the layout to null. So we have to always specify where things are, and this is a bad thing. So well, it's a bad thing because it's a lot of work job for us. And actually, before I go and show you other layout managers, we set our window size to this specific size, but that's because my window is pretty big. My window size is it's 1800 or 1600 by something. It's pretty big. But what if the guy is on a smartwatch? What if the guy is on a phone, right? What if this thing is showing like this? This would be bad. This is why we can't use this thing we call magic numbers or magic values, right? We want to tend to not do these things. We want to allow, if there is some possibility of something managing it for us, where they will understand the width and the height of the screen and determine the positions and determine where it should be, how big it should be, and so forth, so on. Okay, so this is why we want to use not a absolute coordinate system, but a layout manager that will deal with positioning things for us. Okay, and if we go back into our course here, actually, I give you guys the border layout, and well, that's fine. I give you guys this border layout, which actually gives you all different types of layouts, and they're all here. The first layout, which is border layout, gives you by the way, I don't know this by heart, but it gives you this type of layout. We could see it right away visually, so we understand if this is something we want. Gives you something that has a top, a start, a center, an end. Is this something I want? If not, let's go with box layout. Box layout puts them inside a linear direction, so they're placed one after the next, right? And you could see box layout, etc. It gives you a lot of different examples, and this is a fun thing to do. This is a fun thing to see, because then we don't have to manage things, right? Again, you need to do a bit of reading. It's your job and your future job. Hopefully, if you're going into this, it's worth it. Maybe this is not the cleanest documentation, but that's life. What do you want? No one wants to write documentation. Cool? Grid layout is another example. Right? And how do we use a grid layout? Or a box layout or whatever. Actually, it's, I don't know which one you guys want to use. Anyone has any preference? Doing without layout manager. This is the absolute positioning. This is the stuff we were just talking about. Right?
Border layout, sir.
Border layout? Okay. Border layout it is. So it gives you some code, and we could even launch some code here. I don't want to launch anything, but you guys could do it. It gives you the code.java to even look at how it does it as an example. And this is great because now you could read code, you could see examples, you could understand better. So if we read the first part, it says, as preceding picture shows, a border layout object has 5 areas. These are specified by the border layout constants, right? So this is part of this class. There's constant page start, page end, line start, etc. So if we read a bit down, it says the following code adds components to frame, content pane, blah, 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 blah. So notice he added a button, and when he added the button to the JFrame, he had to specify, comma, where it should be positioned. So we're gonna do the same thing. So notice our application right now doesn't have that many things, but it has one component, second component, third component, and fourth. So 4 components. And we noticed that this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, good. So we have enough to position things. And again, we could have put another container in there, another thing that could have taken a list and do that. Actually, we might just do that for fun, just to show you variation. So what we need to do is when we're adding, we need to specify the location it's gonna be. So when inside our initialize, we're adding stuff, right? Control P here. You'll notice the component, right? And we could say the constraint or the index or where it should be. So at the moment, we're gonna say comma, border layout, right? That's the thing you told us to use, border layout. Border layout, dot, it's a constant. Look at this, east, center, etc. So we're gonna say this thing is on the east, wherever that is. We're gonna say this thing, border layout, it's on the west, wherever east, west, if you guys know which direction that is. We're gonna say our button refuse is gonna be, I don't know, south. We're gonna say our button accept is gonna be north. Cool. And a lot of you would say, okay, that's enough, I'm gonna run it and let's see if it works. But the problem is we didn't read enough. We noticed nothing changed. So even though I set this value, it's not being used because if we would have read a bit further, if we would have read somewhere, where is it? I'm trying to skip here because I'm tired of looking at my screen, but you guys should have done this. Don't do as I say, but do as I do. Somewhere along this line, I'm just gonna do it. Somewhere along this line, you should have told the layout manager which layout is it using. So for this frame, this J frame, we need to specify which layout we're using. So this one was null. I'm gonna keep that for your absolute thing. But here, we're gonna set layout. And we're gonna say we're using a new, which layout we selected? A border layout. So we're using a new border layout. And if it takes anything, in this case, we don't really care. Cool? So we're saying the layout manager is the border layout. And the cool part about this, actually I'm gonna run it 1 second. I'm gonna make sure it works one line at a time. The cool part about this, the cool part about this is we do not need to mention the bounds anymore. It might be that I need to set this before. Let's try it again. So no more bounds. Okay, so it might be I need to mention who's the layout manager beforehand, not at the end. So let's go ahead and grab this and put this at the beginning. So when I'm adding the objects, I need to specify beforehand what's the border thing. So let's try this again. And if not, we'll go and read the there we go. Right? So this made sense to me because I have enough experience. I could guess half the stuff and it will be the correct answer. Cool? Any questions? So now, if you notice, we could take off all these bounds and we could let the layout manager, in this case the border layout, take care of that for us. So we have the label, please enter your name onto the east. That's the east. We have the input name onto the west, but notice this is a bit bad because it's actually too small. Right? So that's a bad thing to have. And we can have all these other stuff here and there. So this is something we might need to look into. Cool? So maybe rather than making this, I don't want to modify too much, we'll make this one north. And the one that's actually north, we'll change their code a bit. So we're gonna say, let's say, center for this one for a second. I'm gonna modify it a bit more as we go along. And again, the more you read into it, you'll get to have more fun. So here at the top, I could type in this, press accept. It shows me the same thing. You'll notice the size of this changes to fit the amount of data. This is a really long information. Press accept, right? So far, so good with everyone? So this time, it's positioning things for me, and I got nothing in the west. So the center is kind of taking over everything, which is fine. Now, what if I wanted to, on my on my west side, I wanted to add all my buttons there rather than having one big button, one small button. Well, then we just need to add a container. So rather than adding this thing to my JFrame directly, I could add it to a container that could contain those things. Right? So if we go back to here, to our course, we notice we have components. And does it say if we have containers? Well, does it say if we have containers here? I'll link you guys to containers. Here we go. So containers is something that could hold on to something. And again, a container is also a it's also a component. Remember this is important. A container is a component and a container. So it's both. But a container could contain other components and other containers, but a component could not have other things inside. So as an example, a container could hold on to a JLabel, but a JLabel cannot contain another JLabel. Okay? And by default, we already have a container set for us by default, which is using the border layout to manage it, because this is a JFrame. So what we could do, let's see what containers we have. It doesn't give me a list of containers. Top level containers, there we go. It's not giving me much. Okay, what we could do is create a JLabel, a JFrame inside this JFrame. This one became a window, but this time we want to make it into a container that contains the side information. And after this, we're done, okay? So just bear with me. I know I talk a lot. So let's go. Before our button refuse and button accept, we're going to create another J. Actually, let me see if there's another container we could use. A panel. That's a good one. So we're going to create a panel. This is a container. So container to contain containers or components. And this is because a container is a component. Anyway, we'll understand this as we play around. So this would be on the east side, no, on the west side container. G panel. Does it need anything? Look here, inside the constructor, we could say, who's the layout manager for this? Right? And I'm going to just use this one because I don't know what the double buffered is. So let's go back to here. Let's go back to here and see what kind of container we want to use. Well, one of them, I think it was the flow. The complete blah, blah. So puts, if we read this, it says the flow layout puts components in a row, size at their preferred size. If the horizontal space in the container is too small to put all the components in one row, the flow class uses multiple rows. Blah, blah, blah. So this could be something interesting, but rather than I want to go horizontally, I want to kind of go vertically because it's on the west side. So maybe it's something else. I know grid could do it. Let's see, probably box layout. Yeah, this one looks good. Right, and again, we could read the description to understand it a bit more. I'm just going to skip a bit. So in here, we want to do a new box layout. And this guy is going to be the container. This is not good. West side, can I give it itself? Actually, can I just do this? Nope. So let's see if we could set it after. West side container dot set layout new. What did we say? Box layout, I believe. Box layout. And it says what the container should be. Usually I would say this, but in this case it's probably, what am I missing here? So when you're creating this, I needed to give it two things. So the list pane that we created, see that's a J panel. I don't know if you guys are seeing correctly. So when we're setting the layout for it, we create the new box layout, set the same thing that we just created, and set a box layout page axis, so which direction it goes. So this is good, comma, box layout dot line axis, page axis, y axis. I don't know, we'll come back and play with this. So we'll do the same thing as him, we'll do page axis. Cool. And now that we have this panel, rather than adding our buttons to the frame, we're going to add it to our panel. So here, the add part, we're going to say west side dot add. And here, If we look here, when we add something, it's automatically going to do things for us. So we don't need to create anything else. Right? Hey, Valentina. 1 second, guys. My cat is calling me. I'll come play with you in a second. Okay. So now we add the button refuse, and over here we could also add the button accept, and we don't need to do any of this. Any questions? So if we run this, we messed up, so it's not showing. What do you guys think the issue is? If you have an idea, there's no really wrong answers. The point is to see if our minds could eventually figure things out without someone making a video on everything we would ever need. And in the case of this container is, well, we added the button accept to it, right?
Did we added the west side container to our JFrame?
Yeah, exactly. Well done. Harmanpreet, was it? Good job. So
Yes.
the problem was, even though we added the buttons to our container, we never added the container to our JFrame, right? So what we want to do, sorry if I'm scrolling a lot, my bad. What we want to do over here is to say, you know, add my west side container, because that's also a component. Remember, containers are components and components are just components. So container is a component anyway. And we want to say border layout. Where do we want to position it? We want to position it to the west. So now if we run it.
Semicolon, sir.
Ah, thank you. Sorry, my cat is jumping on me, saying, how come you're not playing with me? All right. So now if you see, we have our accept and refuse being positioned one after the next because the panel is inside of a layout manager box layout, the manager of it basically. While everything else is being managed by our border layouts. Cool? So now if I press, let's say if I type in here, Valentina is my cat, and I say accept, well, hello Valentina is my cat, and if I press refuse, it will show here and on my console. Cool? So does anyone have any questions? And the cool part is, actually, if we go back to our main, wherever our main is, the cool part is our void main, other than all of these comments and this example I showed you, it only has really just this one line, right? This GUI window which creates our GUI for us. And the same way we connected this label, this other window label, we could have sent our airplane to our GUI for the GUI to manage our airplane. And if you remember separation of concern, well, now that we're in a GUI, well, you know, if your airplane was writing to the console, it would be meaningless because the user doesn't see the console, he sees the GUI. Right? So in this case, in the next assignment you have, is to create a GUI for your airplane. And all of the stuff you did inside inside the console to manage your airplane, well, now you'll be doing it inside the GUI. Cool? Any questions? If not, this is the end for today, and I'm never coming back to Swing again. You will be using Swing throughout the semester, but it will be up to you to figure things out, manage things, and so forth. So okay, so just to give you an example, this is the solution I wrote for airplane events. No, not yet. Enums GUI, this one. And again, I'll give you all of these answers as we go along, but the point is not about me giving you the answer, it's about you figuring things out. And I would like us to progress fast enough that we could go do something that's more meaningful than these simple assignments. But we need time and we need experience. Okay, so hopefully it's not gonna open any windows because I don't want that. Good. So let's set our correct JDK and let's go ahead and run it. So this is an example of what you could do. Okay? Doesn't have to be there. But if you look at this design that I did for my last semester, my last class, sorry, my last course, you'll notice I use this component, whatever this is. But you'll notice the container is the east, west, north side, and we also have the box layout, kinda. So now, if I can't start something, notice that, let me zoom in a bit. I hope you guys are seeing zoomed in, I don't know. So now it's showing me, I don't know if you guys are seeing zoomed in because it's weird.
Yes, sir, it's zoomed in.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for telling me. So now if I try to stop, take off, or whatever, again, it's still showing me the errors, but it's not showing it to me on the console. And this is what I meant by separation of concern. The airplane had no reason to know that it's going to show in the console or on the screen or anywhere. It's not its job, right? And if I start the airplane got started, and then let's say I try to increase again. The airplane started, but we didn't take off. But as soon as I take off, notice that the airplane has increased in altitude, and it still kind of gives me an information here for some whatever reason. As I start increasing my altitude, I could decrease, etc. When I reach 10,000, I change the color. I'm making it visually appealing, right? And when I reach to 12,000, I change the picture. And now that my airplane is exploded, you see always the same type of error message. Well, it should have been the same message. This is badly done from me. Okay? Any questions? And if, oops, let's do something here. If we look at our main, this is all that was in my main. Presentation. Oops. Let's bring that down. Notice inside my main, I only create a GUI and I pass in my airplane. Really, I don't keep a reference to it because there's no need. I don't change it or anything. But if I did keep a reference to it, look what I could do. And again, this is not going to work, but we're going to come back to this a bit later. So let's say this airplane here is going to be that new airplane. And now I could say this part, it's airplane. And I could create another GUI, which has the title, this being the command center, let's say, which also grabs the airplane. So now they're both, now two of my GUIs are controlling the same airplane. So now if I start, look at the logic here, and the main is super clean, super nice. Well, it doesn't really mean super clean, super nice, but it's pretty nice. So look at here, this is my command center, and this is my airplane control. So if I start the motor here, there's a problem where here it doesn't know that it got started, and we'll deal with that not today. I want you guys to catch up. Next week we're going to probably do all of this. Maybe we should do it today, to be honest. Anyway, we'll talk about that. So even though it doesn't know about it, it knows that the airplane object is the same one, so I could take off, and you could see it allowed me to do it because the motor got started. And now this one's at 1,000. The moment I say increase altitude on this one, you're going to see it's going to go to 2,000 because the actual airplane object is at 1,000, even though my GUI is not showing it, right? And if I say increase, you'll see it goes to 3,000. If I say decrease over here, it's going to go back to 2,000 because this was 3,000. Right? So if I decrease again, now it's a 1,000. If I'm at 9,000, I say increase here, it's going to go to 10,000. And if I crash the thing here, the moment I try to do any of this, it's going to say, well, the airplane is exploded. We can't do anything at the command center. Cool? Any questions? Okay, so this gives you an idea why we do not want to have any system.out.println inside our airplane. Because it's not its job to take care of errors or of confirmation message. Well, if it can't do something, it will let you know by an exception. And if it does it correctly, you could either return a Boolean if you want from the airplane, or, well, if he has no errors, then it means it done it correctly. Right? All right, guys, give me your questions, because after this is, I'll give you some time to prepare for the quiz, and that's pretty much it. So there's a couple things we still didn't touch, but we're gonna touch it next week. So all the assignments I gave you until the GUI must be done by next week, okay? You need to work at home, and if you don't, it's gonna be bad because we won't be able to finish the course, and you might have to redo this course. And the worst thing is doing it with two different teachers where their content is different. They're gonna try and teach the same thing, but they're gonna teach it to you differently, and that's gonna be a painful experience. Okay, I'm not saying I'm the best teacher, but I'm saying I'm pretty damn good, if my ego could talk. So I hope you work at home, and if you have a question, you could either message it on the Slack channels directly to someone, or you could message me directly, and we'll try to get this figured out. But I would suggest you converse in the group channel. And rather than saying, hey, how do I do the whole airplane thing? You say, well, I'm getting a bit of trouble when I do this. I get this exception error, null pointer thing. Why is that? Here's the bits of my code. Can you explain? Etc. Right? The grades and whatnot matters in the fact that you need those to pass the class. But the real objective would be after you graduate, you got your degrees and whatnot, where are you going to go from there? And all of you will get some job. Some of you will probably not be a programmer, will probably go into some other field. Some of you will get a boring programming job. Some of you get the best job. Some of you are going to get a really high paying job. And what we're aiming for is the high paying, comfortable life programming job. At least that's what I would have aimed for if I was in your shoes. Cool? Any questions before we stop this? Go ahead and stop the recording.